Okay, just to give you a little background about who we are at KirkpatrickPrice, we are a PCI QSA qualified security assessor and a licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to over 300 clients in more than 40 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 10 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. Before I introduce our moderator today, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation if you have any further questions that we don't cover. So please submit those using the Q&A feature, and we'll be sure to address those at the end. I'd like to welcome Todd Stevenson, who will be moderating for us today. He is the VP of Sales and Marketing at KirkpatrickPrice. He is also an information security specialist and certified information systems auditor. He is responsible for client relationship management and directing the firm's sales and marketing strategy. Todd?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to spend a few minutes with us. And as Sarah mentioned, we will be in this series helping you prepare for PCI compliance. We realize some of you may not pursue a third-party audit for PCI compliance, but need to meet PCI compliance as a self-assessment. And so whether you're pursuing self-assessment or pursuing actually a third-party attestation, we want to help you understand and get a grasp of kind of a high-level grasp of the PCI requirements and what you will need to do in order to meet the standard today. So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about us, just so you understand where we're coming from. We are primarily an audit firm focusing on two core areas: regulatory compliance. Many types of services we're providing relate to the CFPB's requirements that they've been actively publishing, and we've been helping clients prepare for compliance with CFPB requirements, as well as providing third-party validation of those through a mock audit. And at our core, we are an information security audit firm providing guidance and audit related to PCI, of course, as well as SOC auditing, SSA 16, SOC 2, FISMA and ISO, and HIPAA as well. So many of our clients come to us for those types of assurance. So we're going to put on the auditor hat today. In fact, I want to go ahead and introduce Barry Williams. Barry Williams is going to be I'm going to be interviewing Barry kind of in an interview style today as we go through the requirements. Going to be asking him various questions related to the requirements. Barry is an information security auditor. He's a senior level auditor. I'm not going to tell you how many years of experience he has, but it's quite a bit. He is a qualified security assessor, so he is qualified by the Standards Council to perform PCI certifications, and as well as a CISSP, a certified in governments of enterprise IT, and a certified information systems auditor as well. So Barry brings a wealth of knowledge, and we're going to be asking him lots of questions today and getting his expert opinion. So as we work through the requirements today. So I want to highlight as well what Sarah just mentioned about the Q&A button at the top of your screen. The WebEx toolbar there has a Q&A option, and please feel free to submit questions there. We're trying to save some time at the end of the webinar today to answer specific questions. So please make sure you utilize that button. So I want to have some introductory comments here before I begin really interviewing Barry and talk high level. First of all, what is PCI DSS? So the Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard is a standard that was jointly developed by the payment card brands, so that's Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express primarily, to provide and enhance cardholder data security and facilitate the broad adoption of consistent standards. So overall, the goal was to protect credit card data, and the most, well, PCI 3.0 was released and became effective January 1 of this year, and then a 3.1 was actually released last week, April 15th, an update to the 3.0 standard. So we are now operating under 3.1. For those of you who are not up to speed on the new press releases that have come out in the last couple months about 3.0, it essentially requires you to use stronger SSL, stronger encryption technologies. SSL and the early version of TLS are no longer considered strong encryption methods, and after June 30, 2016 will not be allowed to be used. So for those of you joining today, that's a recent update to the standard. So who does PCI apply to? So any merchant who stores, processes, or transmit cardholder data are required to be PCI compliant. You entered into a contractual relationship with your merchant bank when you agreed to accept credit card payments. Any service provider who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data on behalf of a merchant, so this would be the payment processors, the gateways, the service providers that are critical to that payment processing service as well, are required to comply with PCI. And then any subservice provider of a merchant or a compliant service provider as well would have to be compliant. A typical example would be a data center. So if a merchant is hosting their systems at a data center, for instance, that process, transmit, or store credit card data, or again, same thing for the service provider is using a data center, for instance, the data center would have to be PCI compliant, even though they themselves may not even accept credit card payments. So PCI really applies to anyone who's touching credit card data ultimately. So PCI in itself is a very robust information security standard. It is focused on the protection of credit card data specifically. There's approximately 212 controls. It is grouped into 6 control objectives and 12 subject areas. So today our intention is to cover control objective 1, which involves the first 2 PCI DSS requirements. So today we're going to be looking at building and maintaining a secure network, and specifically the firewall requirements and password requirements that the PCI DSS highlights. You can see here on this slide the 5 other control objectives and the 10 other requirements that we'll be covering in future webinars. So for everyone's benefit on the call, though there's a lot of confusion about the way to attest to PCI compliance, and the Standards Council has only provided 2 ways. One is a self-assessment. So you select the appropriate self-assessment questionnaire. There are 4 basic versions with some variation, but those are based upon how you collect credit card data and the complexity of your credit card methods of transactions dictate which questionnaire, but ultimately you fill out the self-assessment questionnaire, you self-assess, and you sign your attestation of compliance, agreeing or stating that you comply with the standard. The other method is to have a report on compliance issued by a PCI qualified security assessor, a QSA like us, or another firm. And those are the only 2 approved methods. If you have a third party that you're working with that is offering to attest to your PCI compliance, but they do not issue a report on compliance, then they're not falling within the PCI standards guidelines. So these are your 2 official options. And I think it's worth noting that PCI, unlike many regulatory requirements like the Federal Information Security Management Act, for instance, or the Graham-Leaks-Bliley Act, for instance, for banking, and are legislatively driven, PCI is a privately developed standard that is driven primarily contractually from the payment card brands through the issuing banks, ultimately down to the merchants. So it is really contractually driven. Now, Nevada is an exception. Nevada's state law is that if you process, transmit, or store credit card data by state law, you have to meet the PCI requirements. So if you do business in Nevada, you actually have a regulatory compliant issue as well. So let's talk about the importance of scope right here in the beginning. And this is probably something these 2 slides will probably be in every webinar that we host, even as we move through the standard, because of its criticality. But the importance of scope. So scoping the credit card data environment, cardholder data environment, the CDE, as it's referred to, is extremely critical. It determines the extent to which all controls must be in place. So if an area, if a process, if a technology, if a physical location is in scope, then all the controls apply. If a physical location is completely out of scope, then that location doesn't have to meet any of the PCI requirements. So it's a critical piece to determine what the scope actually is. Errors in scoping lead to serious consequences, and ultimately, if you're self-assessing, obviously you have to determine the scope accurately. If you're seeking a third-party report on compliance, which Visa would consider, for instance, level 1 compliance, then the assessor, the qualified security assessor, has to validate that the scope is accurate, but ultimately the merchant or the service provider or subservice provider ultimately owns that scope. It is their responsibility to maintain compliance of the scope. So I want to get Barry involved on this one since it's so critical. Barry, what are some of the serious consequences, if you will, or that you've seen or heard about regarding inaccurate PCI scoping? I mean, kind of, can you share some insight there for us?
Well, the main thing or most critical thing I do see that I run across is that there basically is no scoping. In other words, the network is flat. There is no segmentation of the network to separate the cardholder data environment from the rest of the network. And by the cardholder data environment, I mean all the devices and applications that process, store, or transmit cardholder data. Now, one way to determine that scope, and this is something I don't see all the time as well, is a good data flow diagram that shows the flow of the cardholder data. Quite often I see a very detailed network diagram, but it doesn't show the flow of the cardholder data. So once you establish that, then you can usually see where you can logically segment the flow of the cardholder data from the rest of the network. Now, preferably you'll be using firewalls or routers with strong ACLs. And there's another issue here about scoping. Many times companies don't understand that the scope of a PCI assessment often extends beyond the CDE, that is beyond the cardholder data environment, because any system that is connected to the CDE is also in scope.
Right.
Applications that process, store, or transmit cardholder data are always in scope. And your domain controllers used to enforce group policies are usually in scope.
Right. So I know that that really is a critical piece. You mentioned environments outside of the CDE that are in scope, and you mentioned specifically an application. You know, would a third-party ASP, a SaaS provider who has live access to the network, for instance, potentially be in scope for a PCI engagement, for example?
Yes. I mean, anyone who manages any part of your environment should be PCI compliant themselves.
Right. Yeah, I know one of the ones that I've seen a lot is managed service providers, company that hires a managed service provider to provide, say, managed security, for instance, and the managed security company has administrative access to the firewall, for instance. You know, then the PCI scope essentially extends to them, and I know that's one that I've personally heard of. Being a potential challenge. So those things have to be investigated very specifically, right, to determine if there is segmentation, and if there isn't, then the scope may be larger than originally anticipated. Would you agree with that, Barry?
That's correct. That's very true.
Great. All right. Next steps. Next slide, Sarah. So, determining the cardholder data environment scope. So again, one of the things you need to think about here is that all people, processes, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data are actually a part of the CDE, and all system components connected to the above. So that includes workstations, web application, database servers, firewalls, router switches, wireless access points, etc. I even mentioned a managed security provider who has live administrative access to the firewall, for instance, from their NOC, their Network Operations Center, for instance, and they're doing live monitoring of a firewall. So there's a constant access there. Then even that system would have to be is considered. So no access to the CDE implies not in scope to the assessment. So, and I know it's a common strategy, obviously, Barry, for companies to reduce their scope, put in firewalls and the proper segmentation to limit the cardholder data environment, to limit their cost of an audit, for instance, or the cost of maintaining compliance. But specifically this point on no access, what does no access mean for PCI purposes? When you segment, in other words, a piece of your network and say they don't have access to the cardholder data environment, for PCI purposes, what does that mean?
Well, this kind of gets into another PCI DSS requirement 7, that says restrict access to cardholder data by business need to know.
Okay.
And this includes access to the data itself, as well as to the systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. And this brings up the need for access control procedures. You'll want to have or make sure that you have a data control policy that's documented and defines those access control procedures. You need to have a policy that's clear, unambiguous, and defines privileged IDs, the use of the principle of least privilege. Your application should be using role-based access. There should be a process of access approval, and a documentation of the automated access control systems in use. So also one thing to consider here is that you may have more than one access control procedure. For example, if you have a Windows domain at corporate and you have standalone Unix servers at the retail stores, you're going to need to make sure that your access control policy is broad enough to access or to address both Windows and Unix.
Gotcha.
So no access means no access unless you have a business need to access that data.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and jump into some more of the specific requirements related to Control Objective 1. So within Control Objective 1, build and maintain a secure network. PCI requirements 1 and 2, install and maintain a firewall configuration to protect cardholder data. Do not use vendor-supplied defaults for system passwords and other security parameters. And for just a cursory read of those first two requirements, it seems fairly simple if you're new to the standard and reading. Yeah, well, we have a firewall, and when we don't use vendor-supplied passwords. But obviously, as you get more into the standard and look into more detail, there's quite a bit of definition around these two. So I want to kind of get into some of those here and introduce them to our audience today, and also kind of, again, ask you a few specific questions, Barry, to see if we can just kind of bring some, put some meat on the bone, if you will, give some context. But so let's talk about 1.1. Here's the first requirement under maintaining a firewall configuration. So 1.1 is establish and implement a firewall and router configuration standards that include the following. And then there's a list here: a formal process for approving and testing all network connections and changes. 1.1.2, current network diagram that identifies all connections. So you mentioned that earlier, like your experience there is a lot of companies have the network diagram, but the piece where they're missing is this next piece, which is 1.1.3, which is current diagram that shows cardholder data flow. So it's pretty critical to PCI that not only do I understand the connections, but how does the credit card data flow through the system. Requirement 1.1.4, requirements for a firewall at each internet connection and between any DMZ and internal network zone. So, typically for most companies, that's going to involve multiple firewalls, as we can see right off the bat. Moving on to 1.1.5, There needs to be a description of groups, roles, and responsibilities for management. I think you mentioned that one earlier as well, Barry. Documentation and business justification for use of all services. So again, the idea with PCI is we want to limit protocols, ports, services running to a minimum, and each of those services has to have a business justification. The idea, again, being strategic, that we limit our exposure as much as possible. And then 1.17, requirement to review firewall and router sets at least every 6 months. So we've got to review, make sure that we're following our policies and procedures and nothing has changed in those 6 months in the course of business and troubleshooting and things like that. So just before we move on to 1.1, just Barry, want to ask, what are the typical gotchas or common gaps that you see here? I know you spoke to some of them already, but are there any new ones?
Yeah, I think some that I haven't mentioned, and it pertains to this slide that you have up now. The biggest gotcha I always come across is the lack of policies and procedures. And 1.1.5, there has to be a formal policy and supporting procedures concerning the description of groups, roles, and responsibilities for the local management of network components. Now, there's, everyone has at least one network administrator, perhaps a security engineer, maybe a director of IT. You may have some administrators that work only on certain devices. For instance, one administrator may be the firewall administrator or the SAN administrator. All these duties need to be formally defined and documented. If they're not documented, you're not PCI compliant. Another thing I run across is that, and this is easily done, to document the use of all services and ports, so forth. This can be a simple table or a spreadsheet of devices and port services allowed to run on the devices in your cardholder environment. And probably doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway, Telnet should not be running.
Gotcha.
And then another thing is this requirement to review firewall and router rule sets every 6 months. To comply with this, you need a detailed description of each firewall and router appliance. And the rule sets for these devices need to be reviewed at a minimum of every 6 months. And this review needs to be documented. Otherwise, how are you going to show that the rule sets have been reviewed? So the review has to be documented, and at a minimum, I would like to see in this documentation the date of the review, a discussion or description of the changes that were made, if any, and the name and title of the individual who did the review.
Okay.
So those are some new ones.
Good. I think that's extremely helpful and worthy of note here too. I know one of the questions that came up as we were preparing this that we hear a lot is, because I think it's so common for companies to hire a third party to manage their firewall. And if that's the case, we've outsourced management of our firewall to an outside IT consultant. What requirements relate to this aspect of their environment? What are the implications of that for PCI? Can you just speak to that briefly?
Well, a lot of times you'll get pushback from the service providers. They'll say, well, we're not directly involved in the processing, storing, or transmitting of cardholder data, so they would like to be ruled out of the scope. But
I gotcha.
That can't be. If an entity manages your firewall, they're a service provider and they must show PCI compliance.
Right.
This can be done by having your QSA audit them, or the best thing that can happen if they can provide an attestation of compliance that shows that they meet all the PCI requirements, then your company is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're hiring an individual as a contractor to come in and manage your firewall, then I would treat this consultant as an employee, basically. In other words, that this person needs to undergo security awareness training, sign all the non-disclosure agreements, and agree to abide by all of your company's security policy and procedures.
I got you.
And I need to make note here as well that there's a new requirement for service providers as of June 30th of this year. Service providers must acknowledge in writing that they will maintain all applicable PCI DSS requirements to the extent that the service provider handles, has access to, or otherwise stores, processes, or transmits their customers' cardholder data or sensitive authentication data, or manages the customer's cardholder data environment on behalf of the customer. So after June, service providers should be providing you with a letter of some sort stating that, yeah, we're going to take care of you. We're going to abide by all the PCI requirements, and this is our promise to do so.
Right.
So if you're thinking about hiring a third party to come in to manage any part of your network, you have due diligence when deciding to use a managed service provider.
Great. Yeah. And I know that's important to mention here. I know that's not something that all companies are aware of, the implications of that. So just wanted to highlight that. Thank you, Barry. So let's move on to 1.2. So here, build a firewall and router configurations that restrict connections between untrusted networks and any system component in the CDE. So, and specifically restrict inbound and outbound traffic to that which is necessary, and specifically deny all other traffic, and then secure and synchronize router configuration files. So some granular requirements here. Just want to ask the question in general, what's an untrusted network? For PCI purposes, what constitutes that, Barry?
Well, the Internet is an untrusted network.
Certainly, certainly.
So, but also your DMZ in your environment is also an untrusted network.
Okay, very helpful.
Attackers are looking, one of the things they're looking for is your cardholder database. That's why your database shouldn't be stored inside of the DMZ, where you normally find, your web servers, DNS servers, email servers, that type of thing. The DMZ should be considered an untrusted network and segmented from the rest of the network.
Okay. Extremely helpful in understanding some of the changes that would need to happen to a typical network topology to be PCI compliant. So thanks for that, Barry. So, okay, let's move on to here to the, install perimeter. So again, under 1.2, install perimeter firewalls between all wireless networks and the CDE, and configure these firewalls to deny all, or if traffic's necessary, permit only authorized traffic between the wireless environment and the cardholder data environment. So a specific requirement to implement a firewall here between a wireless network and the CDE. So I know a lot of clients use wireless access points and things like that. If a client's using a wireless network but they're using it only to administer the CDE, are those networks in scope? Is a common question we get, Barry. How would you answer that?
Well, even if they're only using it to administer any devices, yeah, those are in scope. They're in scope because they're connected to the cardholder environment. So all of the wireless requirements then would apply.
including a firewall, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, your access points and wireless connections should be shown in the network diagram. You have to have a firewall in place between the wireless networks and the CDE. If you're using wireless, you know, you have to have strong encryption for authentication and transmission of the data. For example, weak encryption, WEP, SSL version 2.0 or older is not good enough.
Okay.
Yeah, so, you know, my recommendation is to not use wireless unless absolutely necessary, but if it is necessary, you just have to abide by all of these requirements that pertain to wireless.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks. All right, let's move on to 1.3. So 1.3, again, we're still under requirement 1, prohibit direct public access between the internet and any system component in the cardholder data environment. So, you know, when I read this one, I think of duh, right? I mean, we already do that. We don't let the internet access, direct access, but you know, again, PCI starts getting granular, and that's when it starts making sense. Implement a DMZ to limit inbound traffic, limit inbound internet traffic to IP addresses within the DMZ. Do not allow any direct connections inbound or outbound for traffic between the internet and the CDE. So, implement anti-spoofing measures to detect and block forged source IP addresses from entering the network. So, again, there's obviously a lot of specific requirements here. So what does the DSS mean by public access? Do not prohibit direct public access. What does PCI define as public access here?
Well, first let's say or talk about what the DSS is trying to avoid here. They're trying to avoid direct contact with system components. And by direct contact, I mean if your device has a publicly accessible IP address, then anyone on the internet can communicate directly with that device. That's basically what public access means. It's available from the internet.
Gotcha. And I know one of the common things, Barry, to do is to have Outlook Web Access enabled for Exchange. And, so what if a client has Outlook Web Access installed on their main email server and they use NAT on the firewall to make it available to the internet so that their users can access, their Outlook account through Outlook Web Access from the internet. Does this, break 1.3.1 here, implement a DMZ, and 1.3.2 limit inbound traffic? Kind of what are the implications there?
Well, the important point here, I believe, is that you must isolate the CDE from the Exchange server that's on your DMZ. If you don't, you're not in compliance with the requirements. However, if the Exchange server is sufficiently isolated so that the Exchange server or the Exchange environment is not able to impact the security in any way, any part of the CDE, then you're okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's where the firewall again comes in place to segment the DMZ from the rest of the network.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. And so a couple other requirements here under 1.3. Do not allow unauthorized outbound traffic from the cardholder data environment to the internet. So again, this is, outbound. Again, here, a common hacker, and obviously this is to prevent a hacker from stealing the data, right? Assuming that they actually are able to make access to the database to prevent them from being able to extract the data. Implement stateful inspection, also known as dynamic packet filtering. Place system components that store cardholder data, such as the database, in an internal network zone segregated from the DMZ. So I think you kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier, but what does PCI mean by unauthorized outbound traffic? Unauthorized outbound traffic, what would constitute that?
Well, you have to account for all traffic, both inbound and outbound. Your firewall configuration should only allow traffic that is specifically authorized, and this applies in both directions, in and out. This goes back to the point we made earlier about scope and network segmentation. Large companies with large networks, they're trying to apply the PCI requirements to their entire network. That's very hard to do. So that's why it's a good idea. In fact, it's a very good idea to limit the scope and segment your network as much as possible. I can't stress that enough.
Right. So if you've not done any kind of segmentation and the network is flat, as you will, then every user in the organization has to comply with the data security standard. And this particular requirement can really get in the way of implementing productivity by not allowing, essentially users not being allowed out, right, of the internet could be very restrictive, right? So I get your point. You're saying, so there's also a productivity reason, an efficiency reason, business reason to limit the scope of the cardholder data environment, right?
Right.
I think that's great.
Yeah, the rest of your company needs to do their work. So,
right.
And if you apply PCI requirements to everything, you're just going to have headaches.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I know that's a challenge for companies that are implementing PCI. Beyond just the security requirements are the implication of those to getting business done, right? And so ultimately, segmentation often happens for that reason.
Right.
Not just for that's one cost that's considered in scoping and limiting scope for specifically. All right, so let's go ahead and move to 1.3. Oh, one last requirement: do not disclose private IP addresses and routing information to unauthorized parties. So what methods do most companies use to obscure private or internal IP addresses?
Well, the use of network address translation, also referred to as network masquerading or IP masquerading, that's just a simple method in which the source and or destination addresses of IP packets are rewritten as they pass through a router or firewall. And in this manner, you can't see internal IP addresses from the internet.
Right.
It's just called NATing, network address translation.
Great, thanks. So let's move to 1.4. Install and maintain a firewall configuration, protect hardware data, specifically install personal firewall software on any mobile or employee-owned device that connect to the internet when outside the network, laptops, for example, and which are also used to access the network. So firewall configurations include, so this is the personal firewall, specific configuration settings are defined for personal firewall software. So that configuration is specifically defined by the organization. It's actively running, and it can't be altered by users of mobile and or employee-owned devices. So, again, and those personal firewalls are readily available. It's just something you're going to have to be utilized. And this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Barry, in terms of groups, users, access rights, and things like that. Obviously, if this comes into play where we find organizations that everyone has administrative access to the device that connects to the internet, obviously, everything that the device that connects to the network, obviously presents a challenge here for 1.4, right?
Yes.
Among other things.
Yeah. That's why you don't want your users to have admin access to their laptops or desktops.
Right.
They can install malicious programs, and they can disable perhaps their firewall settings. So.
Right. All right, so let's move to 1.5. Ensure the security policies and operational procedures for managing firewalls are documented, in use, and known to all affected parties. Any comments? I know, Barry, you've mentioned policy and procedure before. Any new comments you have for us here regarding policy and procedure? I know that's a big deal, the DSS.
Well, the phrase known to all affected parties is found throughout the PCI requirements. The idea is that policies and procedures need to be documented, and if they're documented, they have to be disseminated to all appropriate personnel. This applies to all security policies and procedures. When I first started auditing, there's a company, they had a very good security policy for that time, but it was more confidential, and it was under the control of human resources, and no one had access to that policy. Well, what good is a policy if no one can read it? So I don't think most companies are in that place anymore, thank goodness. But a policy is something that everyone should be able to access and use for reference.
Right, including third parties.
Yes. Yes.
Who are providing critical services. So, okay, good. So let's go ahead and move to requirement 2. So that's requirement 1, sort of an overview. Let's kind of move to requirement 2 here, which involves not using vendor-supplied default passwords and other security parameters. So again, right off the bat, always change vendor-supplied defaults and remove or disable unnecessary default accounts before installing a system on the network. So, and you can see here wireless environments in particular being highlighted here. You know, this is another one that you know, I think is kind of, everyone would agree is a real necessity, regardless of whether you're pursuing PCI compliance or not. But what are the most commonly overlooked systems that fall into this requirement? Things that someone might not think about.
Well, sometimes systems are overlooked. This requirement applies to all default passwords, including operating systems, software that provides security services, your application and system accounts, your point-of-sale terminals.
Okay.
And I want to say that we recommend that you not only change the default passwords, but also change the default ID names for example, administrator accounts. One of the things that I've seen quite often, if you happen to have IBM iSeries in your environment, there are all these default IBM supplied accounts that begin with the letter Q. And quite often I see that those default passwords have not been changed. And that makes it easy to breach those systems when that happens.
Gotcha. So, you know, really need to have a good inventory of all systems so that can actually be validated.
Right. That way you don't overlook anything.
Gotcha. And I know that's another requirement we'll get to eventually. So let's go to 2.2 here. Develop configuration standards for all system components and assure that these standards address all known security vulnerabilities and are consistent with industry-accepted system hardening standards. So specifically implement only one primary function per server to prevent functions that require different security levels from coexisting on the same server. So again, this is a potential cost for those that are pursuing PCI compliance or using having one server provide more than one primary function. 2.2.2 enable only necessary services, protocols, et cetera, as required for the function of the system. So we've kind of seen this before. You know, what is included in the list of all system components? So develop configuration standards for all system components. What are the system components that may be frequently missed? Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
Well, that's quite an extensive list. All system components would be any network component, server, or application that is included in, connected to the cardholder data environment. These components would include firewalls, switches, routers, wireless access points, network appliances, and other security appliances. And it includes all different types of servers, web servers, application servers, database, authentication, mail servers, proxy, your network time protocol servers, DNS servers, anything that's being used in the cardholder environment.
Even again, right down to the personal firewall settings for the devices mentioned earlier, right? So it's just one of those things where companies who want to be compliant with the PCI standard have to realize that any system component introduced to the cardholder data environment, a specific configuration standard is going to have to be developed and formally documented, right?
Right.
So finally, 2.2.3 is implement additional security features for any required services protocols, again, that are considered to be insecure. So if there are any services here that, and again, some examples are listed here in the DSS, you have to provide additional security features, compensating controls, if you will. So I know we don't have time to get into that one, but just wanted to mention it. So configure systems here, security parameters to prevent misuse, remove all unnecessary functionality, again, going back to minimum services here. So, I know, just want to ask here, again, the standard says consistent with industry accepted system hardening standards. What would be some examples of an industry accepted hardening standard? Where would people go to get that?
Well, a hardening standard is used to help minimize security vulnerabilities, and this is done by removing, all unnecessary, non-essential software programs and utilities, support services, and so forth. And good standards out there that you could go to would be NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards Technology, SANS, that's the Sysadmin Audit Network Security Standard, and the Center for Internet Security, CIS. Those are your three big ones.
Okay. So I know a lot of companies use VMware and virtualization. Are there any considerations here that our listeners today would want to consider when using virtualization?
Well, once again, here, a big part of the equation is scope. If a virtual component is connected to the hypervisor, the hypervisor itself is always in scope. An entire virtual machine is in scope if it stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, or if it connects to or provides an entry point into the CDE. If a virtual machine is in scope, both the underlying host system and the hypervisor would also be considered in scope.
Gotcha.
Any components running on a single hypervisor are in scope. If that's the case, it's recommended that all components on that hypervisor be considered in scope as well.
Which means?
The point about, pardon?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the point about virtualization is that when you use virtualization, you're introducing another layer of complexity, and it's another way, or increased complexity may also lead to accidental misconfiguration.
Right.
So just caution needs to be used.
Which requires additional configuration standards and et cetera, additional documentation, additional audit steps. Right.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
if you're using virtualization, sure.
Right. So let's move on to 2.3. I'm mindful of the time here. So encrypt all non-console administrative access using strong cryptography. So just want to mention here 3.1, since it was released last week, that SSH is no longer or SSL is no longer considered a strong encryption technology, and TLS 1.0. So essentially needing to see companies move to later versions of TLS ultimately now with the most recent release. So encryption obviously is pretty critical to PCI. So let's go ahead and move to 2.4. Maintain an inventory. I think we mentioned this earlier. This kind of goes back to documentation, but there has to be a complete inventory of all components that are in scope for PCI. So, I know one of the most common challenges that we do encounter in our PCI assessments is weak asset management. What are the most common ways companies maintain an inventory? Is there a particularly effective way to do that that might be helpful for those listening today?
Well, whatever you use, Access database, Excel spreadsheet, I always look for 4 critical things in the inventory. I look for the host name, a description of the primary function of the device, the hardware model, and the software components running on that hardware. I think those are the most critical items to have in an inventory. You can go so far as to include, the serial numbers, and many companies have asset tag systems that does a good job of keeping track of their inventory. I would recommend implementing some type of software to help you do this.
Yeah. Right. All right, so let's move on to 2.5. Ensure that security policies and operational procedures for managing vendor defaults and other security parameters are documented in use and known to all affected parties. So, what are the common gaps here for most companies? And again, I'm focusing on the word ensure. You can also kind of speak to, second question is what constitutes ensure, right? So what are the common gaps here, and what does PCI define as ensure? What constitutes that?
Well, I'll be very short on this one. Compliance has to be achieved and then operationalized. Policies have to be documented and disseminated to all appropriate personnel. And that's it in a nutshell.
Good. All right, let's move on to 2.6. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, and I want to answer a few questions. So shared hosting providers must protect each entity's hosted environment called cardholder data. So I know shared hosting is a common thing, the use of co-location, use of Amazon Web Services, for instance, or Microsoft's cloud. Specifically, these providers must meet specific requirements as detailed in Appendix A, additional PCI DSS requirements for shared hosting providers. What do companies find most challenging here, Barry, in meeting this requirement? Or is there any kind of gotcha or key piece that needs to be addressed here that you see?
Well, Appendix A goes into some detail. The key point here to remember is that the hosting provider must protect the environment of each of its clients according to all of the controls defined in Appendix A. And we could spend a lot of time going through Appendix A. I don't have any particular key ones to pick out here, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I can tell you on our side, from my experience, one of the things that I would mention to everyone on the call today is just the simplification of your PCI compliance being derived from using a shared hosting provider who already has a report on compliance by a qualified security assessor. If you use a shared hosting platform that is audited by a PCI QSA. That QSA is issued a ROC, what we call a ROC, a report on compliance. Then as a QSA ourselves, in validating your PCI compliance, we are allowed by PCI standards to take that report on compliance at face value as is, and we have no longer any responsibility for auditing those controls that are that have already been audited by another PCI QSA. And so whether you're self-assessing or pursuing a third-party audit of your PCI compliance, utilizing a shared hosting provider that has a PCI ROC, and there are plenty on the market, would be would be advised. So those are requirements 1 and 2. I know we just have a few minutes here, Barry, so we want to get into some of these questions. I've also invited Joseph Kirkpatrick, who's the managing partner here at KirkpatrickPrice, and he's also a QSA, PCI QSA himself, to kind of join us here to answer some of these questions. So I wanted to kind of pull the box. We've got a few questions here, Barry. So first I'll just kind of start here, would computer keyboards, and this is again for Barry or Joseph, computer keyboards in a call center type environment be considered a card entry point?
That question really has to do with requirement 9, which we'll talk about in a later webinar. But in version 3.0, there is a new requirement to protect the devices where card data can be entered in, whether that's a point-of-sale system or whatever. I do believe a computer keyboard with the card reader technology built into it, which a lot of call centers and retail organizations have. I do believe that does apply. You have to protect that, and you have to protect it from tampering and educate your employees to notice if something has been tampered with.
Right, and there's been too many breaches where those physical hardware have been swapped out with hardware that is providing that data to unauthorized parties. Right, it's been compromised. And so, Joseph, when you refer to requirement 9, you're referring to physical security, right? Protecting those from physical access.
Right.
Questions regarding description of groups, roles, and responsibilities for management of network components here. Do departments or specific individuals need to have descriptions within a policy, is the question. I think that was related to your comments earlier, Barry. Joseph or Barry, have any comments about that?
Yeah, the job positions, key positions should have descriptions and descriptions concerning their roles involved with security and their main duties and so forth.
Okay.
And I was going to say, since that requirement is in Section 1, talking about firewalls, when I'm looking at the firewall and the groups that are set up, the users, we want to see corresponding documentation about who those users are and what the groups are responsible for. So just corresponding documentation to say these people are authorized as users here in the firewall, and this is their role. This is their set of responsibilities in managing the firewall, for example.
Gotcha. So I know there's a question here about phone systems. So, the question is related to, WAN to internal subnets using NAT policies and firewalls to limit the traffic to a source IP and destination IP addresses for PBX phone systems. What are the implications for phone systems to PCI compliance? Any kind of points there or experience from auditing that would apply to phone systems specifically?
Well, I'll start us off there. I mean, that's in the requirement about restricting public access, and so with a phone system like that, there's a business need for that public access, and I think what's been described there is a good way to do it. You're restricting it to the least privilege. You're saying I'm restricting traffic to this particular IP address, and of course you would document the business need for that. But if the phone system is in the cardholder environment, you know, if people are calling in to you know, some type of a system and placing orders or entering their card number or something like that, then of course the data security standard would apply to that phone system just like the rest of the network, as we've been talking about.
Okay.
Anything to add on that one, Barry?
No, I would agree with that.
So two more questions here, and I know we're right at the hour. Apologize for us running a minute over, or a couple minutes over here. But so a question about all affected parties. The question is, so are all users of the system, quote, all affected parties, or is it a smaller subset of personnel? Let's see what requirements.
I'll make a comment about that. I think it's telling that in version 3.0 that the council moved those requirements from section 12, which is dealing with your information security policy, to the specific sections about managing your network and managing vendor defaults. So I think what they're trying to say there is that you want to have very specific security policies and operational procedures for the people managing the network, for example, managing vendor defaults, you know, setting up new systems, configuring systems, things like that. So to me, the move from section 12 to these specific areas is trying to say to people, you know, let's get away from these broad policies that apply to everybody and aren't very specific, and let's start getting some very specific operational procedures put into place for those who are affected. And to me, that is the people who are managing the networks and configuring the systems on those points. There are obviously policies and procedures that are going to affect the broad user base, but I think in these two requirements we're trying to say, let's have some specific procedures for the people doing those jobs.
Gotcha. Any additional comments, Barry, on that one?
No, I should say not.
Okay. Well, I know we had a couple more questions, but I apologize. We are out of time. I thank you all for attending and joining us for this webinar. We will be continuing this series, and we'll be following up with the next requirements and the PCI DSS, and we'll be sending out an invite for that webinar, so be looking for that. I know there were some additional questions here, so my contact information here is on the slide. Feel free to grab my email address or phone number here, and you can reach me or forward those questions to me either way, and I'll make sure that those questions get answered for you as well. So again, want to thank everyone. One of the questions that we always get is will the presentation be made available? And yes, it will. We will be following up the webinar with a link to download the presentation so that you can have this for reference for those of you who attended today. So again, our thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to our next opportunity. I want to thank Barry for joining us, and Joseph, and for helping me with the webinar today. Appreciate your help on all this. Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.